At 28,000 feet over Germany, the engine quit. No warning, no sputter, just silence where 2,000 horsepower had been roaring a second before. The pilot of the P-47 Thunderbolt watched his propeller windmill uselessly in the frozen air, his airspeed already bleeding away at nearly 400 miles per hour. He had 60 seconds to restart or begin a glide that would end in enemy territory, 40 miles from the nearest friendly airfield. The P-47 Thunderbolt was supposed to be the safest fighter in the American arsenal. 7 tons of armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a radial engine that could absorb punishment that would shatter any liquid-cooled power plant. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, the aircraft that always brought you home. But the men who flew it knew a different truth. The Thunderbolt didn't kill you quickly. It exhausted you. It cornered you. It put you in situations where survival depended not on skill but on endurance, on fuel, margins measured in minutes, on decisions made with frozen hands and oxygen-starved minds at altitudes where human beings were never meant to fight. The popular image of the P-47 is one of invincibility, a flying tank that could absorb flak, shrug off cannon fire, and dive through enemy formations with impunity. Museums display restored Thunderbolts in gleaming paint. Air shows feature them thundering low over crowds, radial engines growling with mechanical authority. Veterans' memorials list the aircraft's statistics with reverence. Over 15,000 produced. More aerial victories than any other American fighter in the European theater. A ground attack record unmatched by any single-engine aircraft in history. What the memorials don't mention is how many pilots died learning to fly it. What the statistics don't capture is the psychological toll of missions that lasted 5 hours or more, where the enemy was often the least dangerous variable. What the museums can't display is the cold. The P-47 was designed in an era when American air doctrine believed in a single, seductive idea. The bomber would always get through. Large formations of heavy bombers, bristling with defensive armament, would penetrate enemy airspace, destroy strategic targets, and return home without the need for fighter escort. The theory was elegant. The mathematics seemed sound. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses carried dozens of machine guns. Overlapping fields of fire would create an impenetrable defensive sphere. Enemy fighters attempting interception would face a wall of lead. Republic Aviation designed the P-47 as an interceptor, a high-altitude defensive fighter meant to protect American coastlines from enemy bombers that never came. The aircraft was optimized for climbing fast, hitting hard, and engaging at extreme altitudes where turbo superchargers gave it performance advantages over conventional fighters. No one anticipated what the aircraft would actually be asked to do. No, one planned for missions that required flying 300 miles into enemy territory, fighting, and flying 300 miles back. No one accounted for the human limits that would determine survival more than any design specification. When the 8th Air Force began strategic bombing operations from England in late 1942, the theory of self-defending bomber formations met reality over occupied Europe. German fighter pilots had spent years developing tactics against exactly the kind of massed bomber formations American planners believed were invulnerable. They attacked from angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire. They concentrated on damaged aircraft, separated from formation. They learned to make slashing passes through bomber streams that lasted only seconds but inflicted catastrophic damage. The losses began immediately. Early missions against targets in France showed the vulnerability. Deeper penetrations into Germany revealed the catastrophe. Bomber crews reported watching aircraft after aircraft fall from formation, some burning, some spinning, some simply breaking apart under concentrated cannon fire. Gunners fired until their barrels warped. Pilots held formation even as aircraft beside them exploded, and still the German fighters came. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at rates that threatened the entire strategic air campaign. Mission reports documented loss rates that sometimes exceeded 10% of attacking force. For every 100 bombers dispatched, 10 or more might not return. The mathematics were unsustainable. At such rates, a bomber crew's chances of completing a 25-mission tour approached statistical impossibility. The problem was not courage. American bomber crews displayed extraordinary bravery, flying into conditions they knew were likely fatal. The problem was range. American fighters could escort bombers only partway to their targets. P-47s of the period could fly perhaps 200 miles from their English bases before fuel considerations forced them to turn back. Beyond that invisible line, bombers flew alone into airspace where German fighters waited in strength, rested, refueled, and positioned to intercept at maximum advantage. The most devastating attacks came not over targets, but during the long return flight, when damaged bombers struggled to maintain formation, when wounded crews fought to keep aircraft airborne, when fuel was low and ammunition was spent, and German fighters pressed their attacks, knowing American escorts could not reach in time. This should have ended the story. This should have forced a fundamental rethinking of American air strategy, a recognition that the self-defending bomber was a myth, that strategic air power required fighter escort to the target and back, that the mathematics of attrition would destroy the 8th Air Force before it could destroy Germany's industrial capacity. Instead, the solution came from an aircraft no one had designed for the mission. The fighters America had in 1943 were designed for a war that no longer existed. The P-40 Warhawk had proven itself in the hands of skilled pilots, but it was fundamentally a low-altitude fighter. Its performance degraded dramatically above 15,000 feet, precisely the altitudes where bomber formations and their interceptors engaged. Sending P-40s to escort B-17s at 25,000 feet would have been like sending them unarmed. The P-38 Lightning offered exceptional range and high-altitude performance, but the twin-engine design brought complexity. 2 engines meant twice the mechanical systems that could fail. The P-38's liquid-cooled Allison engines were vulnerable to coolant leaks from battle damage. A single hit to a coolant line meant engine failure within minutes. In the cold of high altitude over Europe, the cockpit heating systems proved inadequate. Pilots reported frozen extremities, frost-covered instruments, and mechanical failures attributed to extreme cold that the aircraft had never been designed to endure. The P-51 Mustang existed, but the early models lacked the performance to match German fighters at altitude. The original Allison engines limited the aircraft to medium altitudes. The Merlin-engined variants that would later transform the air war were still being tested and produced in limited numbers. They would not be available in significant quantities until early 1944. That left the P-47 Thunderbolt. Republic Aviation had built the aircraft around a specific engineering philosophy. Where other designers sought to minimize weight, Republic embraced mass. Where other fighters used liquid-cooled inline engines for streamlined profiles, Republic chose the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial. Where other aircraft relied on agility for survival, the Thunderbolt relied on brute power and structural strength. The turbo supercharger was the key to everything. Mounted behind the pilot, fed by exhaust gases ducted through. Over 20 feet of piping that ran the length of the fuselage, the system compressed thin, high-altitude air and forced it into the engine at sea-level density. The result was an aircraft that actually performed better as it climbed. At 30,000 feet, where other fighters gasped for air, the Thunderbolt's engine produced nearly full power. But the system came with costs. The turbo supercharger required complex ducting that ran through the belly of the aircraft. Damage to any section of this system could cause catastrophic failure. A single bullet in the wrong place could sever the supercharger's air supply, instantly transforming a high-altitude fighter into a wallowing target unable to maintain speed or altitude. The aircraft's weight was staggering. Empty, the P-47 weighed over 9,000 pounds. Loaded for a combat mission, that weight approached 14,000 pounds or more. By comparison, a German Bf-109 weighed barely 6,000 pounds, fully loaded. The Thunderbolt was literally twice the aircraft. This mass gave it dive speed that no enemy could match, but it also gave it the glide characteristics of a falling safe. A P-47 that lost engine power at altitude would descend rapidly whether the pilot wanted it to or not. The cockpit sat high above a massive engine, giving pilots excellent forward visibility, but creating a blind spot directly behind and below that enemy fighters would learn to exploit. The canopy design in early models was cramped, making it difficult to look rearward during combat, precisely when rearward visibility mattered most. And then there was the range problem. The P-47's internal fuel capacity gave it approximately 2 hours of combat flying time. Accounting for warm-up, taxi, takeoff, climb to altitude, and mandatory fuel reserves for return, the actual combat radius was severely limited. Early Thunderbolts could escort bombers perhaps 200 miles from English bases. Against targets deep in Germany, that meant bombers flew the most dangerous portions of their missions entirely alone. American engineers began working on solutions immediately. External fuel tanks were the obvious answer. Attach additional fuel capacity under the wings or fuselage, extend range, and jettison the tanks when combat began. The concept was simple. The execution was not. Early drop tanks were unpressurized. At high altitudes, the fuel inside would not flow properly without pressure to push it toward the engine. Pilots discovered that tanks which worked perfectly during testing at low altitude became useless dead weight in the thin air above 20,000 feet. Others found that the tanks would not release when jettisoned, either hanging up on their fittings or tumbling unpredictably in ways that damaged the aircraft. Pressurized tanks solved the flow problem but introduced new complications. The pressurization systems added weight and complexity. Fuel lines had to be routed and connected in ways that could be quickly severed in combat. Maintenance crews had to learn entirely new procedures for handling, mounting, and checking systems that had not existed months before. The 75-gallon belly tank was the first practical solution to reach operational units in quantity. It extended range meaningfully, but not dramatically. Pilots could now escort bombers deeper into Europe, but the mathematics remained unfavorable. The deepest targets were still beyond reach. Then came the 108-gallon ferry tanks, pressed into combat service despite being designed for non-combat aircraft transfers. Then 200-gallon tanks. Then combinations of wing and belly tanks that seemed to add fuel capacity almost weekly. Each modification pushed the P-47's range further, but each modification also added drag, reduced maneuverability, and created new failure points. The breakthrough came not from a single innovation, but from the accumulation of incremental improvements. Better tanks, better pressurization, better jettison mechanisms, better fuel management procedures, better understanding of how to nurse an engine across hundreds of miles of hostile territory without burning fuel faster than planned. By late 1943, P-47 groups were conducting escort missions deeper into Germany than had seemed possible months earlier. The combination of external tanks and refined procedures pushed combat radius toward 300 miles and beyond. For the first time, American fighters could accompany bombers to targets that mattered. For the first time, the crisis was under control. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. The problem with sudden expansion was that training could not keep pace with demand. Fighter groups that had spent months preparing for missions of limited duration were now expected to conduct operations lasting 4 hours or more. Pilots who had trained to fly aggressive, fuel-intensive combat profiles were told to conserve fuel in ways that contradicted everything they had learned. Navigation over the featureless clouds of Europe required skills that had been secondary considerations in aircraft designed for point defense. The P-47 was not an easy aircraft to fly under any circumstances. The cockpit was tight, despite the aircraft's enormous external dimensions. Controls were heavy, requiring significant physical effort during extended maneuvering. The aircraft's responsiveness varied dramatically with speed. At low speeds, inputs felt sluggish and delayed. At high speeds, the controls stiffened to the point where moving them required genuine strength. Takeoff was the first test. A fully loaded P-47 with external tanks and full ammunition weighed as much as a small transport aircraft. Getting that mass airborne required building speed down the entire length of available runway. The aircraft's tendency to swing on takeoff, common to all powerful radial engine fighters, was particularly pronounced. A new pilot, who failed to anticipate the torque, could find himself departing the runway before reaching flying speed. The climb to altitude revealed the aircraft's character. The Thunderbolt climbed well, its supercharger maintaining power as the air thinned, but the process was slow compared to lighter fighters. A fully loaded P-47 might require 30 minutes or more to reach combat altitude. During that climb, pilots had to manage fuel mixture, propeller pitch, supercharger settings, and engine temperatures while holding formation with dozens of other aircraft, all making the same gradual ascent. Formation flying was exhausting in ways that non-pilots rarely understood. Maintaining precise position relative to other aircraft required constant small corrections. Each correction burned fuel. Each correction added fatigue. By the time formations reached altitude and began the long cruise toward enemy territory, pilots had already been working for an hour or more. Then the cold arrived. The P-47's cockpit heating system drew warm air from around the engine and ducted it into the enclosed space where the pilot sat. The system worked reasonably well at moderate altitudes. At 25,000 feet and above, it became increasingly inadequate. Outside air temperatures at combat altitude reached 50 degrees below zero or colder. The thin air conducted less heat. Frost formed on canopy interiors. Fingers and toes went numb despite layers of heated clothing. Pilots learned to keep their bodies in constant small motion, flexing fingers, wiggling toes, shifting position, trying to maintain circulation that the extreme environment wanted to stop. They learned which clothing combinations worked and which did not. They learned that standard Army-issue gloves were worthless above 20,000 feet, and that heated gloves, when they functioned, could be the difference between firing your guns and watching frozen fingers refuse to close around the trigger. The oxygen system was another constant concern. At combat altitudes, human consciousness lasted seconds without supplemental oxygen. The P-47 system was reliable when properly maintained, but pilots had to monitor flow rates constantly. Too little oxygen brought hypoxia, a condition whose early symptoms mimicked euphoria and confidence, causing pilots to believe they were performing well even as their judgment deteriorated toward fatal decisions. Too much oxygen wasted the limited supply, potentially leaving nothing for the return flight. Fuel management dominated every phase of flight. External tanks had to be drained in specific sequences to maintain aircraft balance. Internal tanks had to be monitored to ensure fuel was being drawn from the correct cells at the correct times. Running a tank dry could cause engine stoppage. Drawing from the wrong tank could shift the aircraft's center of gravity in ways that made it unstable or uncontrollable. Pilots carried small notebooks where they recorded fuel levels at regular intervals, building a running picture of consumption that allowed them to calculate remaining range. The mathematics were unforgiving. A navigation error that added 50 miles to the return flight could mean the difference between landing at an English airfield and ditching in the Channel. A combat mission tested all of these systems simultaneously. Escort missions typically began with early morning briefings where pilots learned their assigned bomber formations, expected routes, known enemy fighter concentrations, weather conditions, and emergency procedures. The briefings were dense with information that pilots tried to compress into memories they could access during the stress of combat. Engine start occurred while darkness still covered the airfield. Dozens of R-2800 engines coughing to life, blue exhaust flames visible in the pre-dawn, ground crews moving between aircraft checking for leaks, confirming external stores, giving final thumbs-up signals. Takeoff came in rapid sequence, aircraft rolling at intervals of 30 seconds or less, each pilot watching the aircraft ahead climb away and turning to follow, the formation assembling in the air over England as the sun rose behind them. The climb to altitude could take the first hour of the mission. Pilots settled into cruise settings, checked fuel states, tested weapons by firing short bursts into the sea below. Radio chatter was minimal. Conservation of battery power and operational security kept transmissions brief and essential. Landfall over occupied Europe brought the first heightening of alertness. Pilots began scanning the sky with renewed intensity, knowing that enemy fighters could appear from any direction at any time. The formation tightened. Wingmen closed toward their leaders. Cover elements took positions designed to maximize mutual protection. Contact with the bombers was always a moment of relief and increased tension simultaneously. The Thunderbolts had found their charges. The mission's primary purpose could begin. But the presence of bombers meant the presence of what bombers attracted. The enemy wasn't the hardest part anymore. By the spring of 1944, the mathematics of air combat over Europe had shifted dramatically. American escort fighters were reaching targets they could not have touched months earlier. P-47 groups accompanied bombers deeper into Germany with each passing week. The P-51 Mustang, now equipped with Merlin engines that gave it altitude performance to match its exceptional range, was arriving in increasing numbers. American fighters could now engage German interceptors not just over the approaches to target areas, but over the targets themselves and beyond. The German fighter force that had seemed invincible began to crack. The reasons were cumulative. American fighter tactics had improved through hard experience. Pilots had learned to exploit the P-47's advantages in dive speed and high-altitude performance, while avoiding situations where the aircraft's weight became a liability. They had learned that the Thunderbolt's initial disadvantage in a turning fight could be converted to advantage by extending away and returning with superior energy. But tactical improvement alone did not explain the change. Germany's fuel situation was collapsing. Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants and Romanian oil fields was cutting the supply of aviation gasoline available for pilot training. New German pilots were reaching operational units with fewer training hours than their predecessors. Some arrived with barely enough experience to take off and land safely, let alone engage in combat against experienced opponents. The experienced German pilots who had terrorized American bomber formations were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe's operational tempo ground down its veteran corps. Pilots flew mission after mission without adequate rest, accumulating fatigue that degraded performance and judgment. The ones who survived the Americans had to survive their own exhaustion. German aircraft production actually increased during this period, one of the war's great industrial ironies. Factories dispersed and hardened against bombing produced fighters in growing numbers, but aircraft without trained pilots were only aluminum. Aircraft without fuel were only obstacles on crowded airfields. American pilots reported the change in incremental observations. Enemy formations seemed smaller. Interceptions came later, as if German fighters were being hoarded for specific engagements rather than thrown at every mission. When combat did occur, the opposition seemed less coordinated, individual pilots acting without the disciplined mutual support that had made earlier encounters so deadly. The escort missions that had once been desperate battles became, for stretches of time, almost routine. Thunderbolts cruised alongside bomber formations through airspace that would have been thick with enemies months before. Pilots scanned empty skies where they expected attacks that did not come. This should have meant safety. It did not. The German jets arrived in late 1944 too, late and in too few numbers to change the war's outcome, but terrifying to pilots who encountered them. The Me-262, powered by twin jet engines, was faster than anything in the American inventory. A Thunderbolt diving at maximum speed could not catch an Me-262 flying level. The German aircraft would flash through formations, fire brief bursts, and accelerate away before American pilots could respond. But the jets were rare. Their engines consumed fuel that Germany could not spare. Their airfields were prime targets for the very fighter bombers they were meant to defeat. They appeared as individual threats, sometimes claiming victims, but never in numbers sufficient to restore German air superiority. The feared threat never fully materialized. American pilots learned that the jets were vulnerable during takeoff and landing when their speed advantage disappeared. Fighter groups began staking out known jet bases, waiting for the vulnerable moments when the advanced aircraft were slow. The skies grew quieter. Resistance thinned. Escort missions became escort missions in name only, with Thunderbolts sometimes flying the entire penetration and withdrawal without seeing a single enemy aircraft. That's when losses accelerated. The P-47's transformation from escort fighter to ground attack aircraft seemed logical at the time. With German air opposition fading, the Thunderbolt's capabilities seemed wasted on escort duties. The aircraft's rugged construction, originally designed to absorb the punishment of high-altitude combat, appeared equally suited to absorbing the ground fire that made low-level attack missions so costly. Its .850 caliber machine guns could devastate soft targets like trucks, trains, and troop concentrations. Its ability to carry bombs and rockets added destructive capacity that fighters were not typically expected to deliver. Fighter groups that had trained for air-to-air combat were retasked for ground attack. Pilots who had learned to scan the high sky for enemy fighters now learned to scan the low terrain for targets. The transition came with minimal formal training. Pilots learned ground attack techniques through operational experience, discovering what worked and what killed, through trial and the accumulated wisdom of survivors. The missions were fundamentally different from anything the P-47 had been designed for. Escort flying happened at altitude, where the thin air and vast distances gave pilots time to observe, react, and make decisions. Ground attack happened at treetop level, where the world rushed past at speeds that compressed decision-making into fractions of seconds. A pilot diving on a target had perhaps 5 seconds of usable attack time before he had to pull up or collide with the ground. In those 5 seconds, he had to identify his target, adjust his aim, fire, assess results, and begin his pullout. The Germans had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of attack. Anti-aircraft defenses around valuable targets were dense and well-practiced. Light flak guns, firing at rates that put hundreds of rounds in the air per minute, created curtains of projectiles that low-flying aircraft had to penetrate. Heavier guns tracked approaching aircraft and fired aimed bursts that could destroy a fighter with a single hit. The P-47's armor was concentrated around the pilot and critical systems, a design philosophy that had proven itself in air combat. A cannon shell that struck the engine would be absorbed by the massive radial, its 18 cylinders providing redundancy that inline engines could not match. A shell that struck the pilot's seat would be stopped by armor plate that had been added specifically to protect against attacks from behind. But ground fire came from below. The belly of the Thunderbolt was not armored against heavy-caliber projectiles. The fuel tanks, though self-sealing against small arms fire, could be ruptured by larger rounds. The control cables that ran through the fuselage were vulnerable to damage that could render the aircraft uncontrollable. More critically, the physics of ground attack created vulnerabilities that armor could not address. A pilot attacking a target had to commit to his dive. Once established in a strafing run, pulling up early meant missing the target entirely, wasting the risk already accepted. Pressing the attack meant flying predictably into aimed fire, giving gunners on the ground precious seconds to track and lead an incoming aircraft. The escape was no better. Pulling up from a low-level run left the aircraft momentarily slow and nose-high, presenting its vulnerable belly to any gunner who had tracked the attack. The maneuver that saved the pilot from the ground exposed him to the fire designed to kill him. Pilots learned to vary their attack profiles, coming in from different angles, pulling up unpredictably, never giving gunners a pattern to anticipate. They learned that the first aircraft over a defended target often got through unmolested, while gunners were still identifying the threat. The second and third aircraft absorbed increasingly accurate fire as defenders found their rhythm. They learned that the flak suppression runs flown by lead, aircraft intended to silence defensive guns before the main attack, often did exactly the opposite, alerting defenders and bringing every available weapon to full readiness. Losses climbed even as enemy air opposition faded. Operational records from this period show a pattern that contradicted the popular narrative of the Thunderbolt as an invincible ground attack platform. Aircraft that could survive multiple cannon hits from German fighters were being destroyed by single impacts from ground fire. Pilots who had flown dozens of escort missions were being killed on their first or second ground attack sortie. The statistical shift was striking. During the period of intense air combat, the majority of fighter losses came from enemy aircraft. As air opposition decreased and ground attack missions increased, the majority of losses shifted to flak. The skies had become safer at the exact moment that the missions had become more deadly. The final category of loss was the one that appeared in no official statistics. Pilots who pressed attacks too aggressively, aircraft that flew into their own bomb blasts, Thunderbolts that struck terrain while maneuvering at speeds that left no margin for error. Collisions with the targets themselves, whether telephone wires, trees, buildings, or the locomotives they were strafing. A pilot diving on a train had to judge his pull-out altitude while focusing on his target through a gun sight, while managing his speed to stay within the aircraft's structural limits, while tracking the locomotive's movement, while watching for defensive fire, while aware that the slightest misjudgment would drive 7 tons of aircraft into the ground at 300 miles per hour or more. The ground was unforgiving, It did not care about kill ratios or mission success or the pilot's previous experience. It was simply there, waiting for any lapse in judgment, any mechanical failure, any moment of task saturation to claim another aircraft and another life. End beat silence. A pilot who survived being shot down over occupied Europe faced odds that varied, depending on factors entirely beyond his control. Geography mattered first. Being shot down over France in 1944 was different from being shot down over Germany. Being shot down over rural areas was different from being shot down over cities that had been bombed repeatedly. Being shot down in winter was different from being shot down in summer. The parachute descent itself was dangerous. German pilots had learned early in the war that enemy airmen were valuable targets even after leaving their aircraft. Some continued firing at descending parachutes, others did not. An American pilot hanging in his harness, watching the aircraft that had shot him down circle back, had no way of knowing which kind of opponent he faced. Landing brought immediate decisions. A pilot in his flight suit and Mae West, possibly injured, definitely visible, had to decide whether to move immediately or stay hidden. Moving increased the chance of encountering friendly civilians who might help. It also increased the chance of encountering German forces or collaborators who would not. The escape and evasion training American pilots received was necessarily general. Europe was too large, occupied populations too varied, circumstances too unpredictable for specific instructions. Pilots were told to seek help from rural populations, avoid cities, move at night, trust almost no one, and try to reach neutral territory or resistance contacts who might guide them to safety. The reality was more chaotic than any training could prepare them for. German forces maintained extensive networks for capturing downed airmen. Civilians were offered rewards for reporting American pilots and punished for helping them. Collaborators infiltrated resistance networks, leading American airmen to believe they were being helped while actually leading them toward capture. The men who might save you looked exactly like the men who might betray you. Pilots who evaded capture successfully often spent weeks or months moving through occupied territory, dependent on strangers whose motivations they could not know, whose languages they often did not speak, whose trust they had to earn, while revealing nothing about the networks that were helping them. Some made it to Spain and eventual return to England. Some were hidden for months until liberation forces reached their locations. Some were passed from family to family, each host risking execution for the crime of sheltering an enemy airman. Those captured faced a system designed to extract information while maintaining deniability. The Luftwaffe operated interrogation centers where captured airmen were held in isolation, questioned repeatedly, and subjected to psychological pressures designed to break their resistance without leaving visible evidence of mistreatment. Interrogators had extensive files on American units, aircraft, and personnel. They often knew more about a pilot's squadron than the pilot himself, using this knowledge to create the impression that cooperation was pointless because everything was already known. The interrogation phase was temporary. Most airmen were eventually transferred to permanent prisoner of war camps operated under theoretical Geneva Convention protections. Conditions varied enormously between camps, between time periods, between the nationality of guards, between the ever-shifting circumstances of a war that Germany was increasingly losing. Food was inadequate almost everywhere. Red Cross packages, when they arrived, made the difference between chronic hunger and actual starvation. Medical care was minimal. Wounds from the shoot-down and capture often healed poorly, or not at all. Diseases spread through crowded barracks where sanitation was difficult and resistance was lowered by malnutrition. The psychological toll accumulated invisibly. Men who had been active, skilled, proud of their abilities were reduced to passive, waiting. Days blurred into weeks, into months. News from the outside came slowly and unreliably. Rumors of Allied advances brought hope that was often premature. Rumors of German countermeasures brought fears that were often exaggerated. As the war turned against Germany, conditions deteriorated further. Guards became more hostile, supplies became more irregular. The threat of being caught in the fighting as Allied forces approached added a new dimension of fear. The forced marches of early 1945 killed prisoners who had survived years of captivity. As Soviet forces advanced from the east, German authorities evacuated camps westward, marching columns of weakened men through winter conditions without adequate food, shelter, or medical support. Prisoners collapsed and died on roadsides. Others were shot for being unable to continue. Even surviving the mission didn't mean safety. The Pacific Theater presented a completely different mathematics of survival. European missions, for all their dangers, took place over a continent. A pilot shot down over France or Germany was over land. Rescue was unlikely, but survival was possible. The ground below, however hostile, was ground. A man could walk. The Pacific was water. Missions from island bases to Japanese-held targets might cover hundreds of miles of open ocean each way. A pilot whose engine failed over the Pacific had no fields to land in, no roads to follow, no populations that might help. He had the sea, which was vast and indifferent, and whatever survival equipment he carried, which was limited. The P-47 served in the Pacific, though in smaller numbers than in Europe. Its range limitations, already problematic over occupied France, were magnified by the distances involved in Pacific operations. But the aircraft's ruggedness proved valuable against Japanese aircraft that were often lightly built and vulnerable to the Thunderbolt's heavy armament. The ground attack role that had proven so costly in Europe was even more demanding in Pacific conditions. Japanese defensive positions were heavily fortified. Island garrisons had months or years to prepare for the American assault they knew was coming. Bunkers were reinforced with coral and concrete. Anti-aircraft positions were dug in and camouflaged. Fields of fire were cleared to maximize the effectiveness of defensive weapons. The targets themselves were often small and difficult to identify from the air. A bunker that dominated a stretch of beach might be invisible from altitude until it opened fire. A gun position that pinned down advancing infantry might appear as nothing more than a shadow in the vegetation until its muzzle flashes revealed its location. Supporting ground forces required pilots to operate at altitudes where they could see the targets they were asked to hit. This meant flying low enough to identify specific positions while being fired at by weapons they often could not locate until the rounds were already coming. The margin between effective support and suicidal exposure was measured in seconds and feet. Navigation errors that might add 50 miles to a European mission could be fatal in the Pacific. Fuel consumption calculations that assumed calm air and direct routes were invalidated by weather that could appear suddenly and force detours that burned reserves meant for return flight. The weather itself was an enemy in ways that European pilots rarely experienced. Tropical storms developed rapidly and violently. A pilot who launched under clear skies might return to find his base obscured by weather that made landing impossible. Alternate fields, if they existed, might be beyond fuel range. Water landings were survivable in the P-47 if executed correctly, but the aircraft's weight worked against the pilot once the aircraft was in the water. The Thunderbolt did not float for long. A pilot had to exit, quickly inflate his survival raft, and separate from the sinking aircraft before it pulled him down with it. Life raft survival in the Pacific was its own form of endurance test. Pilots carried limited supplies of water and rations. Fishing gear and desalination equipment were theoretical aids that required skill and luck to be effective. The sun was relentless. Dehydration came quickly. Sharks circled. Rescue required being found, which required being roughly where rescuers expected you to be. A pilot who had drifted off course before going down, or who had been moved by currents after landing, might be searched for in entirely the wrong area. Search aircraft had limited time on station. Submarines detailed for rescue duty had other missions. Surface vessels were committed to combat operations. The pilots who were recovered often owed their survival to chance as much as preparation. A glint of metal seen from a search aircraft, a direction correctly guessed by a rescue coordinator, a current that happened to carry a raft toward rather than away from friendly forces. The pilots who were not recovered became statistics in a category that encompassed everything from combat loss to operational accident to simple disappearance. The ocean kept its secrets. Bodies were rarely found. Fates remained uncertain. The Pacific weather was a force that made the European theater seem benign by comparison. Thunderstorms in the tropics were not the organized systems that European pilots learned to navigate around. They were violent vertical eruptions that could destroy an aircraft with turbulence alone. Pilots caught in the cells reported being thrown against cockpit structures hard enough to cause injury. Aircraft emerged from storm encounters with structural damage from forces that exceeded design limits. Flying around the weather often was not possible. Storms could stretch for hundreds of miles, blocking every practical route to target. Flying through meant accepting violent turbulence, zero visibility, potential structural damage, and disorientation that could last long after the aircraft emerged. The alternatives were sometimes worse than the storms themselves. Flying above the weather required climbing to altitudes where fuel consumption increased dramatically and human performance degraded. Flying under the weather meant operating at altitudes where terrain clearance became questionable and navigation became nearly impossible. One aspect of Pacific operations that accumulated losses steadily was ferry and transit flying. Aircraft had to be moved from rear bases to forward airfields, from training units to operational squadrons, from damaged strips to repair facilities. These flights were long, over water, often without escort or support, and conducted by pilots who might be fatigued, inadequately briefed, or unfamiliar with the aircraft they were delivering. The ocean swallowed these losses quietly. An aircraft that failed to arrive at its destination might have suffered engine failure, navigation error, fuel miscalculation, weather encounter, or any combination of factors. Investigation was often impossible. The aircraft was simply gone, the pilot with it, the cause unknown. Operational accidents accumulated in ways that barely registered against combat losses but added substantially to total attrition. Training flights that ended in crashes, maintenance errors that went undetected until flight, mid-air collisions in crowded airspace around active bases, ground loops on takeoff from primitive airstrips carved from jungle. The worst days in the Pacific were often not the days of heaviest combat, but the days when weather, accident, and operational tempo combined to claim multiple aircraft without enemy involvement. Records from various Pacific units during intensive periods document this pattern. Days where several aircraft and pilots were lost with no enemy contact recorded. Engine failures over water, navigation errors that led to fuel exhaustion, weather encounters that destroyed aircraft faster than enemy fighters could. The Japanese, by this point in the war, had suffered attrition that made their air opposition sporadic and often ineffective. Their experienced pilots were largely dead. Their fuel supplies were critically low. Their aircraft were often reduced to suicide missions that sacrificed machine and pilot for the chance of a single kill. But the P-47 pilots dying over the Pacific in the war's final months were mostly dying to the environment, to the distances, to the weather, to the mechanical realities of operating complex machinery at the edge of human and engineering limits. The enemy had faded. The dying had not. The last months of the European war brought a strange acceleration of loss, even as victory became certain. The German military was collapsing. Industrial production had cratered under sustained bombing. Fuel shortages grounded most remaining aircraft. Territory shrank daily as Allied forces advanced from west and east. The question was no longer whether Germany would surrender, but when. And still pilots died. The ground attack missions continued because ground combat continued. German forces fought defensive battles that required air support to break. Retreating columns had to be interdicted. Rail lines had to be cut. Bridges had to be destroyed to slow enemy movements that no longer had anywhere meaningful to go. The targets were often defended by troops who knew they were losing and fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to protect but their own survival. Flak gunners, who might have surrendered if given the opportunity, instead fired at every aircraft that appeared, extracting whatever price they could from enemies they could not defeat. Pilots flew these missions with the knowledge that the war was ending. The mental arithmetic was unavoidable. A pilot who had survived 3 years of combat might be killed in the war's final weeks over a target that would be captured by ground forces within days. The strategic necessity of each mission became harder to believe when the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. The operational tempo did not decrease. If anything, pressure increased as commanders sought to accelerate German collapse and reduce the duration of ground combat that was killing American soldiers daily. More sorties meant more exposure. More exposure meant more losses. Mechanical failures that might have been caught by thorough pre-flight inspection slipped through as maintenance crews worked to keep aircraft flyable at maximum tempo. Aircraft that should have been grounded for repair flew instead, their problems deferred until the urgency passed or the aircraft became unflyable. Pilot fatigue accumulated in ways that no amount of willpower could overcome. Men who had been flying combat missions for months were still flying combat missions. Rest periods were shortened. Leave was canceled. The same pilots flew day after day because there were not enough replacement pilots to maintain the tempo otherwise. Errors of judgment increased. Pilots pressed attacks that should have been broken off. Navigation mistakes led aircraft into areas of unexpected opposition. Formation discipline degraded as exhaustion eroded the concentration required to maintain precise positioning. The accidents that resulted from fatigue were indistinguishable from combat losses in the records, but entirely different in their causes. An aircraft that crashed short of the runway might have been damaged by enemy fire, or might have been flown by a pilot too tired to judge his approach correctly. Both were dead. The difference mattered only to statisticians. The final weeks produced losses that seemed especially cruel precisely because they were so unnecessary in retrospect. Pilots who had survived the worst of the air war died attacking targets that would have been irrelevant within days. Men who had beaten statistical probability dozens of times over were killed by random flak hits in the war's closing hours. The war was ending. The dying wasn't. In the spring of 1945, a P-47 pilot nearing the end of his combat tour prepared for what records indicate was to be among his final missions. He had flown the Thunderbolt through the transitions that marked the air war's evolution. Early escort missions where German fighters rose to meet every penetration. Middle period missions where opposition was heavy but manageable. Late-period missions where the skies had emptied of enemy aircraft and the ground had become the primary threat. His experience was etched in the small behaviors that distinguished veterans from newcomers. The way he checked fuel levels at intervals so regular, they had become unconscious. The scanning pattern his eyes followed across the sky, never resting, never assuming safety. The physical economy of movement that conserved energy on long missions. The briefing that morning was routine, a ground attack mission against transportation targets in an area where German resistance was collapsing but not yet ended. Expected flak was listed as moderate. Weather was acceptable. Nothing in the mission parameters suggested unusual danger. But men who had flown combat knew that danger was not listed in briefing packets. It appeared without warning in the form of a single shell that found its mark when 1,000 others had missed, in the form of an engine that chose that moment to fail, in the form of a target that was more heavily defended than intelligence had suggested. Some pilots described a sense that preceded certain missions, a weight or unease that had no rational basis, but proved accurate more often than chance should have allowed. Operational records do not capture such intuitions. They record only what happened, not what pilots felt before it happened. The mission proceeded normally through takeoff, climb, and cruise. The formation crossed into German-held territory without incident. The target area appeared ahead, rail yards where locomotives and rolling stock sat waiting for destruction. Ground attack missions against rail targets followed predictable patterns. Aircraft would make strafing passes along the length of trains, their 8 machine guns tearing through locomotives, freight cars, fuel tanks. Pilots had learned to aim for locomotive boilers, where hits could produce spectacular explosions. They had learned that passenger cars might contain troops and deserved the same attention as military cargo. They had learned that secondary explosions from ammunition or fuel cars could be as dangerous as enemy fire. The flak came up as the formation began its attack runs. Light guns tracking the diving aircraft, heavier guns firing at the altitude where pullouts would occur. The pattern was familiar. The responses were practiced. Aircraft jinked on their approaches, varied their attack angles, tried to deny the gunners predictable targets. What happened next is recorded only in the mission summary and the loss report that followed. An aircraft was hit during its attack run. Whether the pilot was killed immediately or struggled to control damaged aircraft will never be known. The Thunderbolt went down in occupied territory, joining the thousands of others that had preceded it. The war would end within weeks. The pilot's name would be added to memorial rolls that grew longer even as victory approached. No heroics, no dramatic final transmission, just the mathematics of probability finally finding a number that matched. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, celebrations erupted across England and America. For the P-47 groups still operational, the celebration was complicated. Men who had survived cheered with genuine relief and joy. They had lived through something that had killed so many of their friends. They would see their families again. The future they had wondered if they would reach had finally arrived. But celebration required accounting. Aircraft that had launched on final missions before the surrender was signed had not all returned. Pilots shot down in the war's final hours might be prisoners, might be dead, might be wounded in hospitals that were only now being reached by advancing forces. The joy of ending was interrupted repeatedly by the administrative reality of determining who had made it and who had not. Some fates remained uncertain for weeks or months. Pilots shot down over territory still in flux between surrendering German forces and advancing allies might be recovered, slowly or not at all. Aircraft that had gone down in remote areas might not be found until local populations reported them. Bodies that should have been recovered were never found because the circumstances of their loss remained unknown. The notification process continued even as victory celebrations faded into demobilization planning. Families who had allowed themselves to hope when the war ended, received telegrams and visits that told them their hope had been premature. Their loved ones had survived the worst of the fighting, but not the war itself. For survivors, the transition to peacetime brought its own challenges. Skills honed for combat had no civilian equivalent. Reflexes trained into automatic response needed to be unlearned. The heightened awareness that had kept pilots alive in combat became hypervigilance that disrupted normal life. The camaraderie of squadron life gave way to individual reintegration into a society that could not understand what they had experienced. Stories that seemed routine to men who had lived them were incomprehensible to families who had only waited. The gap between those who had been there and those who had not proved difficult to bridge. Some returned to flying careers, their skills still valuable in the emerging commercial aviation industry. Others found the idea of flying impossible to consider, the aircraft too closely associated with memories they wanted to leave behind. The choice was personal and varied, but the war had marked every pilot who flew it in ways that would not fade. The P-47 squadrons were deactivated in the months following surrender. Aircraft were scrapped in enormous numbers. The aluminum that had been so valuable months earlier now surplus to be disposed of. Only a relative handful were preserved, the vast majority reduced to ingots that bore no trace of their history. The pilots dispersed to civilian lives that would last decades for the fortunate ones. They would age, raise families, build careers, watch the world change in ways they could not have predicted from their cockpits over Germany. And some part of them would always be the young men who had climbed into those massive fighters and flown toward horizons where death waited. The P-47 Thunderbolt became a legend after the war ended. The statistics were impressive and widely repeated. Over 15,000 produced. More enemy aircraft destroyed than any other American fighter in the European theater. A kill ratio that demonstrated the aircraft's effectiveness in air combat. A ground attack record that contributed materially to the collapse of German logistics. Museums acquired surviving examples and restored them to gleaming condition. Air shows featured Thunderbolts flying low over crowds who thrilled to the sound of the R-2800 at full power. Veterans organizations kept the memory alive through reunions and publications that celebrated the aircraft and the men who flew it. The narrative that emerged emphasized invincibility. The jug that could take punishment no other fighter could survive. The aircraft that always brought its pilot home. The flying tank that absorbed flak and cannon fire and kept fighting. It was a true narrative as far as it went. The P-47 was tough. Its survival rate in damage-producing encounters was remarkable. Pilots did bring back aircraft that should not have been flyable. The design philosophy that had prioritized ruggedness over agility proved itself repeatedly in combat. But the narrative was incomplete. It did not include the pilots who died before learning the Thunderbolt's quirks. It did not include the men lost to fuel exhaustion on missions that pushed range limits beyond safe margins. It did not include the pilots who survived being shot down only to die in captivity. It did not include the ones who made it home, but were never the same. The aircraft that became a symbol of American air power was also an aircraft that demanded everything from the men who flew it. It was heavy, difficult, unforgiving of error. It did not kill easily, but it did not protect easily either. Survival in the P-47 was earned through skill, endurance, and luck in measures that varied by mission, by theater, by the particular. Arrangement of circumstances that determined who lived and who died. The men who flew it understood this in ways that memorial plaques could not capture. They knew that the aircraft's toughness was real but not magical. They knew that the margins were always thin, that the next mission was always uncertain, that the statistics applied to groups, but individual fates were decided by moments. When people talk about the P-47 Thunderbolt, they talk about success. But for the people who flew it, success was surviving what came after.